preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Phil Miller. I'm the director of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life here at the 92nd Street Y. On behalf of the Bronfman Center and the Y, welcome all of you here this evening. Before I introduce this evening's guests, it is our minhag, our custom at the Bronfman Center, to give a few quick program notes before we begin each evening's event. Next month, we continue our Forum on Contemporary Values series, hosted by 92nd Street Y scholar in residence, Rabbi David Woznicka, and noted author, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. On February 13th, they will be joined by guest Anita Diamond, author of the best-selling Red Tent. And later this spring, on April 17th, they will be joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Wendy Wasserstein. On this Sunday morning, February 3rd, Dr. Elisheva Karlbach returns to the 92nd Street Y for our Everett Institute series. She will be discussing Jewish life in early modern Germany. And now for this evening's speakers. Monsignor Tom Hartman is the Director of Radio and Television at Telecare, the television center for the Diocese of Rockville Center. Ordained in 1971, Father Tom is perhaps best known for his television show, The God Squad, co-hosted by Rabbi Mark Gelman. He also does his own productions for Long Island on Telecare, including the popular Father Tom and Friends. His national radio show, Journeys Through Rock, is heard on hundreds of stations on the ABC radio network. Father Tom is the author of If Just a Moment, Life Matters with Father Tom, and The Matter of Life and Death. He also has co-authored 3 books with Rabbi Gelman for both children and adults, including the award-winning Where Does God Live and How Do You Spell God? Father Tom has been recognized for his professional and pastoral work with 4 Emmy Awards, a Telly Award, and numerous honorary doctorates. We have had him here at the Y many times, and it is a pleasure to welcome him back to our stage again. Before becoming a writer, author James Carroll James Carroll was a Catholic priest. He was ordained in 1969 and was then assigned to Boston University, where he served as Catholic chaplain until 1974. During those years, he published numerous books on religion, religious subjects, and an award-winning weekly column in the National Catholic Reporter. Carroll eventually left the priesthood to become a writer, publishing his first novel, Madonna Red, in 1976. The book has been translated into 7 languages. Since then, he has published 8 additional novels, including Mortal Friends and The City Below, which was a New York Times notable book of 1994. He also authored the memoir, An American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us, which won several prizes, including the 1996 National Book Award in Nonfiction. Most recently, he authored Constantine's Sword, which is the subject of this evening's discussion. He wrote Constantine's Sword while on fellowship at Harvard University, where he is a research associate at the Center for the Study of Values in Public Life at the Divinity School. Carroll also writes a weekly column on culture and politics for the Boston Globe. There will be an opportunity for question and answer later on in this evening's program, and both our guests will be available outside the hall following their discussion this evening. Father Tom Hartman and Mr. James Carroll.
We are overwhelmed that there was such a great response to this evening's presentation. We're grateful that you've all come. And Jim and I come here as 2 spiritual people who deeply love Judaism as well as Christianity. And we want to explore actively with you some of the good things and some of the bad things, because we come here so that we can go down the road together. We believe in one God. We believe in the covenant that God gave to Abraham. We believe that through community, great things can happen. We believe that the church and the synagogue are imperfect instruments, and that the people in them sometimes reflect the best of life and sometimes the worst of life. We come here as people who like to think and want to be a part of this world in a creative way. We've both chosen to be the painter rather than the paint. And we join with you as active searchers, looking for truth, not looking so much for hostility as much as truth that would lead to changing those things that need to be changed and embracing those things that need to be cherished. Before we begin the discussion, I'll be asking Jim about the book. I want to tell you that my best friend is a rabbi, Rabbi Mark Ellman, and that we go on Imus in the morning. Now, everybody has to amend for something in their life. And the reason why the rabbi and I go on Imus in the morning is because we believe in hope. We believe that a lot of people go to work, go into jobs that they don't like to go to, and they could use a laugh. We believe that a lot of people at different times in life maybe have had an argument with someone, or maybe have gotten a pink slip, or maybe aren't feeling as well as they usually do, and we'd like to be a source of clarification. When I was asked to come this evening, I felt honored because I think Jim's work is an honest work, it's an important work, it's a challenging work, and I think it's going to be one of the seminal works in trying to bring in an intelligent way some of the faults of the past to the light of day and some sort of healing process to continue and to deepen. So I want to present to you a great author, James Carroll.
Well, of course, I'm deeply honored to be here in this distinguished place, joining Father Tom in the tradition that you all have established here that is such a beacon of inspiration to us everywhere in this country. And I also have to begin by acknowledging my deep gratitude to you, Tom, for this conversation that we're about to have with each other. The truth is, in my experience, the history of Christian anti-Semitism and the great questions that the Christian habit of anti-Semitism raises is a question much more for Christians than for Jews. And it's appropriate that two of us pick up the discussion before we invite a broader discussion with you all, because in a very basic way, the problems raised by this history belongs to us more than to anyone. Would you agree with that? Pick it up any way you choose?
First thing I want to ask you is, in the history of the Catholic Church, there was a defining moment when Constantine allowed Christianity, encouraged Christianity in that. Now, you name your book Constantine's Sword.
Right.
Can you share with us why?
Well, I will try to answer that as succinctly as I can. The whole story, this book began in an impulse of mine to understand the record of church failure during World War II in relationship to the Holocaust. And the first thing I discovered as I began to confront that was that it wasn't enough to push back into the 30s and 20s of the 20th century. I had to understand the role of anti-Semitism in the Christian mind in the 19th century, the Dreyfus Affair. I had to understand where that came from. Suddenly I'm pushing back, and it began to dawn on me at a certain point that this is going to take me all the way back, as it does, to the first generation of people who define themselves by their discipleship with Jesus of Nazareth. And that's why this is such a long book. I would never have set out to write such a long book. And I certainly, since I'm not a professional historian, I'm an amateur historian, and I like that word because amateur means you do it out of love. I would never have taken on such a subject if I'd known at the outset how impossible it was to, and because the subject then is the links, the causality, the links through history up to the 20th century. To understand what church failure in the 20th century was, you really do have to go back to the first immediate years after the death of Jesus.
And as you went back to those early years...
I've avoided your question, you notice, but I want to get to it. I want to get to it. I want to get to it.
As you went back to those early years, when did anti-Semitism begin and why?
Well, let me
not answer that.
Let me ask you to hold that. That is the most important question for us Christians to confront. But on Constantine, let me just say that, just to remind you, you know this, I know you know this, but Constantine is remembered as the emperor who converted to Christianity in the year 312. It's probably better to remember 312 as the symbolic year in which Christianity converted to become the Roman Empire, because that's actually more what happened. But the reason this is a pivotal moment, enough so that I named the book after it, is because between 312 and the age of Constantine, you might say, begins in 312 with the mythical conversion, and it ends, you might say, in 428 or so, when the Roman Empire abolished the Patriarchate of Israel, ending Jewish political autonomy until 1948. And how did that happen? What happened in 428 to make that pivotal event take place? And of course, it begins in 312. In 312, Jews and Christians are two more or less comparable minorities in the large Roman Empire. Scholars tell us that they accounted perhaps for something like 10 or 15% of the broad population of the Roman Empire. Constantine became a Christian. In hindsight, that seems like it was the logical thing for him to do, but it wasn't. It made as much sense, it would have made more sense for him to become a Jew, in fact. Why did he do it? Constantine's agenda in 312, having begun as his father's successor, as one of four claimants to the Roman Empire, in 308 or 36, something like that, as a young man. He was waging a war for control of the whole empire. And in the year 312, there's a legendary battle on the Tiber River as he's moving into Rome. And he has a vision the night before the battle. In the sky, he sees the cross. And on the strength of that vision, he believes in the Christian God, orders the next morning his soldiers to shapen their spears into a literal cross and to go into battle as a Christian army. And in the story, they were underdogs. They went into battle and they won. And on the strength of that victory, Constantine's faith in the Christian God was confirmed. His soldiers believed it. And that began the triumphant march across the empire, which led to his complete victory over his rivals, which he accomplished over the next 12 years or so. Now, much too complicated to go into it much more than this, but there are 2 points to make. One, Constantine's Christianity was at the service of his political agenda, which was to unify the empire. And once he identified himself with the Christian God, he imposed the Christian God on the empire. And in 325, he solidifies his hold on the empire by defeating his last rival. And what was the first thing he did? He got the bishop to call the first council of the Catholic Church, the Council of Nicaea. And what did they do? They defined Christian faith. Christians today, you and I, still recite the Nicene Creed. It's the basic definition of Orthodox Christian faith. Why was that important to Constantine? You can't say what a Christian is unless you can say what a Christian isn't. And at this point, it's only at this point that a hard and fast line gets drawn between Orthodox Christianity and heresy. It's only at this point, in fact, that a hard and fast line gets drawn between what is a Jew and what is a Christian. Archaeologists tell us that up until this time, you can't fully distinguish between the tombs of Christians and Jews. In the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, many Christians continued to observe the Sabbath on Saturday with Shabbat services at home on Friday evening. Many Jews, likewise, revered the memory of Jesus. And it's only with Constantine that the rigid line begins to get drawn, and it becomes drawn with power. And over that next century, what we think of as the argument between the church and the synagogue really begins. And it begins with violence. Don't forget, by the end of that century, the emperor is using violence to impose Christian orthodoxy. If you're a heretic, you are given a choice. Abandon your heresy, accept Orthodox Christianity, or die, which is why we don't know any Arians or Nestorians. Pagans begin to be given that choice. Convert to Christianity or die, which is why paganism begins to disappear from this story. Interesting, and this is the last point I'll make in this long-winded answer, but why this period is so pivotal to this discussion of what happens between Jews and Christians. In the late 4th century, key figures in the church, especially Ambrose, the most powerful theologian bishop in Christianity, accept the idea that how we're treating Christian heretics, and even how we're treating pagans, that's how we should treat Jews. That is to say, Jews too should be given the choice, convert or die. Ambrose accepts that. Ambrose's protege, St. Augustine, rejects it. And Augustine, in the year 426 or so, publishes the City of God, in which he argues that Jews must be allowed to survive within Christendom as Jews. 2 years later, the Patriarchate of Israel is abolished. Augustine's argument, because he has succeeded Ambrose as the most powerful theological figure in the church, carries the day with other negative consequences that we can get into or not in the discussion. But that's why Constantine's period is so important. And finally, the cross that was the emblem of his conversion becomes the central emblem of Christianity only now. Constantine's mother, St. Helena, is remembered as the one who discovered the true cross. And the true cross is conscripted into the church's argument, especially with Jews. Helena is remembered, for example, as being led to the true cross, hidden in Jerusalem by a traitor Jew, a kind of Judas. These stories now of antagonism between Judaism and Christianity become not only powerful, they become edged with the threat of violence.
Jim, you mentioned throughout your book that Christianity was looking for a symbol.
Yes.
And it chose the symbol of the cross.
Yes.
And in choosing that symbol, one of the questions attendant to that was, well, who caused Jesus' death?
Right.
If the church had chosen another symbol,
right,
such as the resurrection or
right,
some other symbol,
right,
you contend that the church would have probably been less anti-Semitic.
I would like to be able to say that, although history doesn't actually allow it. I do track the negative consequences of the fixation on the cross, not only for Jews, but for Christianity.
Let me just interrupt for a second. At least for myself, growing up as a Christian on Long Island, when I walk into a church and I see Jesus on the cross, to me, it's not a triumphalistic sign. It is an example of the love of God. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe he came on earth to die for our sins. And as I look at the cross, it is something that inspires me. But throughout history, that cross was used in different ways, frequently as the way God wills that anyone who doesn't believe in Jesus would be killed, Muslims and Jews. So it is problematic. But when I was reading in your book, some of the negative notions of that. Or let me say one more thing. I was once on a show with Rabbi Gelman, and we were talking about Auschwitz. And remember when Avi Weiss went over the wall with a few people and they attacked the sisters? Mark and I were on News 12, and I looked at Mark and I said, Mark, I don't understand you Jews. Now you have to understand, I love Judaism. As a result, I go to his synagogue so often, they send me a dues bill. And I would have joined, but he was talking to me about circumcision, so I figured. So out of love, I said, Mark, I don't understand you Jews. If you knew anything about these sisters, they're spiritual. They're trying to redeem this place, not to redeem Jews, but to redeem the ashes of this place. And I don't understand. They're like my grandmother. Why would Avi Weiss ever go over the wall? And with that, Mark looked at me and said, Tom, for you, the cross is a symbol of love and sacrifice, great sacrifice. But for us Jews, it isn't. It's just the opposite. Many of the soldiers led with the cross and said, God wills it, de lavo, as people were killed. So when I read Jim's book, I had even further information that I didn't have in my own historic background. And could you help share it with all of us?
Well, the greatest experience I had in writing this work of history as an amateur was I discovered that the mistaken idea I had that when things are the way they are, I basically somehow got it in my head that they had to be like that. Not true. And to do the work of history is to discover how things might have been different. Take the cross. We Christians, I'm with you. I love the cross. There's a cross on my writing desk. The cross is a symbol of compassionate love to me. It came as the biggest shock of my work in this to realize that the cross can be perceived and can actually have functioned as the opposite of compassionate love, as a symbol of triumphalism, of power, of violence, of murder. One of my inspirations, an Episcopal theologian by the name of Paul Van Buren, once said that in order to see Auschwitz through the perspective of the cross, which is, I believe, what those sisters wanted to do out of best intentions, it's important to see the cross through the perspective of Auschwitz. It looks different. I would say that one of the most important subtle movements in Christianity right now is we are retreating from the centrality of the cross. Its obvious negative consequences on the enemies of Christianity, on Jews, but also terribly negative consequences on us Christians, to put suffering at the center of our affirmation like that. You asked about whether if the cross had less central a place in our Christian imagination. In fact, it doesn't have this place in the imagination of Orthodox Christianity. The cross is the central icon of Latin Christianity. Mm-hmm. The central icon of Orthodox Christianity is still the face of Christ. The icon that you've all seen in Eastern Orthodox and Russian Orthodox churches. There's immediately a hint, tragically, of the answer to your question. Would the Christian church have been less anti-Jewish if the cross were not so central? The experience of Russian Orthodoxy doesn't suggest it would. Although it is important for us Latin Christians to always acknowledge that the ferocious anti-Semitism of Eastern Christianity never became genocidal. That happened in the Latin West. But it does suggest that there's something even more basic than this symbol at the root of Christian anti-Semitism. Let me just say that in the reform that is so powerful in Christianity and in Catholic Christianity in particular in this period, one of the signals of it is we are letting go of the centrality of the cross. You've noticed this in new churches. I don't know about your churches, but if you go into a new liturgically reinvented Catholic church today, you'll see a baptismal font as a central symbol of the organization of the sanctuary, sometimes dominating over the cross, which was unheard of a generation ago. Why? Because in the first generation of Christian belief, the great symbol of dying with Jesus was in water, in the metaphor of baptism. And it was really, again, coming back to Constantine, I do argue, it's controversial, I acknowledge this, but I do argue that Constantine is the one who basically puts the cross at the center of the Christian imagination. And with his mother, and then with St. Ambrose, it is quickly brought into service as a weapon with which to attack Jews. So all of that is to say, we Christians need to re-examine many fundamental things about our beliefs, but certainly the cross is one of them.
I know as a kid, sometimes I would go to a church and you'd see these god-awful crosses, the agony, etc. And the attempt at the time was to let you know how much Jesus suffered for you. Then an Episcopalian friend of mine invited me to his church, and I saw not Christ on the cross, but I saw the cross and Christ above the cross in his resurrected form. And he looked so much more peaceful and so much more inviting. In the journey through history, one of the areas that is so painful, and if you could outline it for us, I'd appreciate it, is the Crusades.
Yeah. Well, the Crusades, of course, the word crusade means war of the cross. In fact, when President Bush inadvertently used the word crusade to describe the war against terrorism early in the autumn, the Arabic press translated the word crusade in the Arabic for the word crusade, which is war of the cross. And I think we Christians would perhaps be invited to have a different memory, a less romantic memory of the Crusades, if we didn't call it that. There are Catholic high schools and colleges that have their sports teams called the Crusaders. Dwight D. Eisenhower entitled his memoir of World War II, Crusade in Europe. That's the spirit in which President Bush used the word. The Crusades were the occasion of the first savage pogrom in Europe. You remember 1096. 1095, Pope Urban II calls the Crusade, which is a war to reclaim the Holy Land from Islam, from the infidel. And of course, I earlier made the point that Constantine's religious piety had a political purpose. Urban II had a political purpose. The Christian princes in Europe were at war with each other. How can I get these princes to stop fighting each other? They're making a mess of Europe. The war against the outside enemy was the solution. And in 1095, Urban II called on the Christian princes to come together and launch a war against the infidel to reclaim the Holy Land, which is remembered in the Christian imagination by now as the place of the cross. The Crusaders begin to muster in large numbers in the north of Europe in the spring of 1096. You know this, but we Christians don't know it. We must know it. And what was the first thing those Crusaders did? Moving through the Rhineland, they attacked the powerful, glorious centers of Jewish life that were up and down the Rhine River, especially in Mainz. I cite the first attack in Trier, but in Worms, in the spring, in a period of a few weeks, in the spring of 1096, these Crusaders, they were not organized as an entity. They were a marauding band of ruffians, but they put to death, they gave to those Jews the choice, convert or die. And they put to death literally thousands. Scholars are divided as to how many thousands, maybe 10. A huge number given the proportion of population in that period. And it was an absolute trauma for Europe, a trauma for Christianity, a trauma for the Jewish community of Europe as well. You know this. The chronicles offering lament for the death of Jews in the Rhineland in 1096 are still featured in the liturgical memory of Jewish prayer. Gone to the Christian memory. One of the most common responses I have from Christians who read Constantine's Sword is they never knew this about the Crusades. They never knew that the violence against Jews was so powerful that the church itself immediately mobilized against it. The Pope condemned it. In the next crusade, a couple of decades later, St. Bernard of Clairvaux deliberately went to the Rhineland to preach to the people of the Rhineland, do not attack Jews. It's a shock to the Christian conscience. It's also a shock to the Christian conscience to say, as one must today, that the Christian church never repudiated the violence against Islam in that period. What does all of this have to do with us? The event of the Crusades set in motion consequences that led to the ways in which people still think about conflict between Christians and Jews. The powerful impulse to convert Jews that was set loose in the Crusades continued, even if it was pursued less violently. And the medieval movement to convert Jews had other consequences down the road that I track.
Another painful period in the history of the church is the Inquisition.
Right.
Can you share your insight about that?
Well, it's a brilliant follow-up to the point I just made, because, in fact, the great consequence to that unleashed movement to convert Jews comes about when the conversion, one of the things that stunningly consistent through the centuries, of course, is the Jewish refusal to convert and the preference even to death and to martyrdom. And in the Rhineland, the impulse of Masada lives again, with suicide entering the Jewish story once more, rather than convert. But in 1391, in Iberia, large numbers of Jews did convert in response to a particularly savage Christian assault. And that seemed to be another one of these turning points in history, because what happened? That set in motion in Iberia this powerful Christian demand that Jews convert. And many, many Jews began to convert in Iberia. Some, no doubt, out of authentic religious reasons, but many, probably most, out of fear of losing their livelihoods, losing their possessions, losing their lives, losing their place in society. And guess what the Christian church discovered? You can't trust a coerced conversion. It's like, hello. Suddenly there are tens of thousands of coerced conversions. Are they authentic? Are they sincere? Which led in the next century to the establishment of an institution expressly designed to find out, are these conversions authentic? Which is, of course, the Inquisition. Now, why is this important for our story? You go back to that first question you asked that you folks thought I was really avoiding. What's the origin of antisemitism? You could say that what we're talking about even through the most egregious periods of the first millennium of this dark story is not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Judaism. It's contempt for the religion of Jews. But individual Jews are always regarded as able to convert, to become fully members of the community. Baptism brings you fully into the community. So that anti-Judaism is an anti-religious movement, but it is not racial. That changes in the Inquisition. Because the new phenomenon of the converted Jew, the converso, the new Christian so-called, suddenly these people are suspect even if they're baptized. And the conversos and the children of conversos and the grandchildren of conversos down to the 5th generation could not hold office in the municipality, could not hold office in the church. They had what was called blood impurity. The ultimate expression of let his blood be upon us and upon our children. And what does this mean? It means we have gone from a religious definition of contempt to a racial definition of contempt. And this at the very dawn of the modern age, an idea that will take root in the European mind. And let me just quickly add one more point. Something even more diabolical takes hold now, because in the Christian imagination, the secret Jew becomes the demonic figure on whom everything gets blamed. Plagues, even the heresies. Catholics, some Catholics, many important Catholics, the emperor, were convinced that the Protestant Reformation was a Jewish plot. What does this mean? It means that the converso, the secret Jew, English, we get the word cabal from Kabbalah. What is a cabal? The conspiracy. The idea that the Jewish enemy is attached to the body of Christendom, destroying it from within, which of course has its masterpiece expression in the German idea of the Jew attached to the body of the German folk like a parasite. And a classic instance of where do the Nazi ideas come from? They don't spring whole out of the air. They come from this Christian past, and that is the conclusion that we must come to about the Inquisition.
So there was a development in the idea. For a long time it was, if we could wipe out the Jewish religion, because they don't accept Jesus, became some people have converted and they are not authentic about it, so it moved from the religion to the persons.
Right.
And that set the scene for what Hitler did.
And I would say, thankfully, the Catholic Church, the Christian Church generally, repudiated eventually this idea of blood impurity. And certainly in the world you and I were raised, there was none of this. And one of the things that makes the story of World War II particularly tragic is the way in which the church with energy defended baptized Jews. Because the way in which the Vatican distinguished itself from racist Hitler, the racist anti-Semitism of Hitler, and condemned it, was Hitler didn't recognize the power of baptism. To Hitler, a baptized Jew was a Jew. And one of the things that we Christians have to acknowledge is that much of the effort to defend Jews during the Holocaust was actually a defense of baptized Jews. But the basic point to make is that the church had returned to this basic notion, which is that all human beings are of one family, and there was a repudiation of this racist contempt that is rooted in a kind of, well, what comes to be known in the 19th century as this perverted genetics. That's gone from Christianity, although we have to confront this history fully, and in the 20th century there were still powerful institutions in Catholicism that had continued it. One of the great shames I report here, having been educated by Jesuits at Georgetown University, and I'm a deep admirer of the Jesuit order, but the Jesuit order had on its books until the 20th century the prohibition of anyone of Jewish descent back to the 5th generation being brought into the order.
Wow.
And that was not removed formally and explicitly until 1927. It was turned into a euphemism, and the euphemism wasn't removed until 1946. So the Nuremberg laws had, in many instances, exact precursors in Christian theology and practice.
See, when I was growing up on Long Island, I remember when I was about 12 years old, Eddie Klopfer, who lived across the street and was Jewish, asked me if I would join the Jewish Y. I wanted to join the Jewish Y. I didn't know what the Jewish Y was, but it was my friend asking me. So I went to ask my folks, and they didn't know what to do with the question, so they said, well, why don't you go ask the priest? And the priest said no. Also, Bobby Kirk down the block belonged to the East Williston Community Church, and he asked me if I would join the East Williston Community Church Cub Scouts. So I wanted to join it because my friend asked me. So I asked my folks, they said, ask the priest, and the priest said no. That was the experience that many people like myself had. It wasn't so much that we had a sense of thinking the less of Jews, it was that we were encouraged to stick with our own. It wasn't just not going to a Jewish synagogue, it was not going to a Protestant church. I think the priest was afraid that if I went to another church, I might convert. That was the issue. Since then, since Hitler, we do have stories of people like Pope John the 23rd being very helpful. But at the same time, we have the story of Pius XII and a cautiousness. You see the way he approached the communists, how forthright he was of rooting out communism, but he wasn't that way. He was silent in many ways. And according to many historians, he thought that he would jeopardize Christians and Jews if he took a more active role. What is your take?
I'm a critic. Really, I don't have much
Doesn't
use for it.
surprise me.
And I don't need to belabor it particularly, but I would say that one of the great tests coming into the future of the seriousness of the official established Catholic Church and its determination to leave anti-Semitism and this dark history behind is what we finally make of Pius XII. And I regard it as a crucial question whether the movement to advance him towards sainthood is stopped or not. I think it would be a moral disaster for our church if that movement, and there is some movement in that direction apparently even now, were to succeed. I don't believe it will myself. But let me just say that, you know, this 2,000-year-long history that I'm tracking here, of course, you refer to your youth, I refer to my youth. You used the phrase just now, since Hitler. I think it's also very important for us Christians to acknowledge very directly that the difference between the tradition into which we were born and what we're grappling with today is the Holocaust. Seems obvious. It isn't that fully admitted yet, that the Holocaust was the revelation, which is why for me Pius XII's silence is not the crime. It's the evidence. The evidence of what? It's the evidence of this long tradition of contempt for Jews and Judaism, and this is what it led to. I say that fully insisting on the explicit guilt of the Nazi perpetrators, separating that from the decisions made, even anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic decisions made by people before them. The Nazis did something particularly new and perverse with this tradition. But we Christians we Catholics in particular, have yet to fully confront that the Nazis could not have done it without what we prepared the ground with. And
do you lay that blame also on Franklin Delano Roosevelt in America?
No, I don't. Whatever you make, the failure of the world was complete. Europe, America, was prepared to let the genocide succeed. The Christian church was prepared to let the genocide succeed. So it's not about, and it is, I also don't believe it's particularly useful to try to measure guilt and so forth, but it's very clear that the genocide almost succeeded and that the world was prepared to let it succeed. So there's not much exonerating to do here. But the responsibility of a politician like FDR is different from the question put to the conscience of Christianity. And it's different also, I would say, from the question put to the heart of European civilization. Western European civilization, for all of the Russian pogroms, the genocide did not take place in the East, in Eastern Europe. In fact, it did literally take place in Eastern Europe and Poland to a large extent, but that was because, of course, the Nazis went there to do it. But this is the burden facing us. Now, let me just say, I'm speaking of this as a Catholic, out of the Catholic question, because you referred to John the 23rd. The entire revolution, here's the thing that I've come to understand and that humbles me. The entire theological and religious revolution that we Christians have been living through my whole adult life. You were ordained in 71. You went in the seminary during the Vatican Council. I entered the seminary just before the Vatican Council. The Vatican Council turned the church on its head, ended the Counter-Reformation period when priests were telling us not to go to Protestant churches. Why did John the 23rd do that? This overweight, roly-poly, peasant pope who was a compromise candidate who was supposed to just keep the chair of Peter warm for a couple of years. Why did he startle the church and startle the world? Well, it was clear. He had seen the church fail during the Holocaust, and he did something about it. And you know his story enough to know that he did see it, in fact, from a very rare perspective as a prelate who was himself a rescuer, one of the few prelates in Europe who was a rescuer. And when he became pope, he said, this church has to change. And I would just say that one of the key influences on him was Jules Isaac, the Jewish historian who wrote a book in 1948, you know the book, Jesus in Israel. And what was Isaac's point after the Holocaust? He said, the attitudes of anti-Semitism that gave expression to this disaster are rooted in basic Christian ideas, even in the gospel. And an assertion in 1948 that Christians did not want to hear. And Jules Isaac was reviled in the Christian world. One of the first things Pope John the 23rd did was invite him to the Vatican. And they met in June of 1960. And Isaac recorded in his diary that he gave the Pope a copy of his book. And he said the Pope received it warmly. This is a book that challenges Christianity to its Gospels. And after that meeting, John the 23rd, who had already called his council, ordered the organizers of the council to put at the top of the agenda the church's relationship with the Jewish people. And it was his initiative that led to that fundamental confrontation with the original slander, the first blood libel, that Jews are the deicide people, the murderers of Jesus. And you all know that in 1965, in Nostra Aetate, the Vatican Council repudiated that slander formally, the most fundamental revision of Christian theology in 1800 years that we're still trying to be worthy of and trying to figure out where it takes us in our theology. Nostra Aetate affirms the permanence of God's covenant with Israel. When Jews first heard this, Jews were inclined to be insulted. We need someone to tell us God's covenant is permanent, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't addressed to Jews. It was addressed to Christians. And the Christians are still grappling with it. If God's covenant with Israel is full, complete, permanent, do Jews need Jesus? Hello? We haven't finished grappling with that yet. The answer, of course, is no. But Christian theology, this is how Christian theology moves. Fits, starts, slow, but John the 23rd. Now, it took the worst crime in history for the corruption of anti-Semitism in the heart of the church to be revealed for what it is. But the church has been, bit by bit, desperately trying to confront it.
One of my friends was Pope John the 23rd's best friend. He was his valet, and to be his valet, he did everything for him. And so I would get together with him, and he would tell me stories about Pope John the 23rd. One of the stories was he was in the papacy about 6 months, and he was walking in the gardens. And a gardener came up to him and said, "How many people work here?" And the Pope said, "About half of them." Then he had an expression which I often use and quote, and you might like it also. See everything, overlook a great deal, change a little. And I find when people come in for counseling and they're overwhelmed, it's usually they're trying to take on everything. His advice is pretty solid. Jim and I would like to take a look at the present, not at all abandoning all of the scarred past that you've talked about. It seems as though if somebody can feel it, it seems as though if somebody has a relationship, like, for example, my love for Judaism, I never would have come to the love for Judaism that I had if I didn't have a friend who was a Jew. I'm convinced of that. Rabbi Gelman and I often say that when you have these prayer services in which people, different religious leaders get together, and you know that they don't know each other. You know that they come together once a year. Mm-hmm. That really doesn't do it. It's when you have a friend and you lean on each other and you want the best for that person. I want Mark to be the best Jew he possibly can. And he wants me to be the best Jew I can. He says to me, listen, Tom, you got 2 billion Christians and we have like 147 Jews. He says, let's face it, there's enough Christians in the world. We need more Jews. But one of the privileges in my life, I was asked to help set up in Rome for the Pope, the time in which, I'm talking about Pope John Paul II, when he met with 70 Holocaust survivors. And it was an extraordinary day. We were all awed by the Vatican. It is, if you've ever been inside those rooms, it's really extraordinary. And he walked in, and there's something special about this. He has a glow about him. He's an extraordinary person. He says what he believes and believes what he says. You may not always agree with what he says or believes, but he is, I think, maybe the only world leader who does that. And
can I jump in with you on this?
Sure.
On appreciating John Paul II.
Mm-hmm.
I said a few minutes ago that St. Augustine made this powerful point that Jews must be allowed to survive in Christendom as Jews, but he also said they can never thrive. And the dispossession of Jews was going to be symbolized by two things: the dispersion from the Holy Land and the permanent destruction of the temple, because Jesus is the new temple. When John Paul II went to Jerusalem 2 years ago, there were 3 critical moments. The first was when he met with Ehud Barak, and formally, in a way that no pope ever had, Paul VI's quick visit to Jerusalem in the mid-60s was a pious visit to the Via Dolorosa, but he made a point not to meet any officials of Israel, and he made a point not to in any way seem to be affirming the Jewish state. John Paul II, having recognized the Jewish state, affirms the permanent return of the Jewish people to Jerusalem and to Israel in the powerful encounter he has with Ehud Barak. I would argue a reversal of that first note of Augustine. And the second point is this profound ancient Christian denigration of the temple as a theological proof. The destruction of the temple as a proof of the truth of Christian claims is reversed when this pope, and I'm sure you remember it, leaves that wheeled conveyance of his, walks across that broad plaza leading up to the Western Wall. A slow, it was impossible not to see it as painful shuffle, where he prayed at the Western Wall, inserted the small piece of paper with the act of repentance for the sin of antisemitism between the crevices of the stones, and where he prayed as the Jew prays, without invoking Jesus. And a profound act of theological reversal, an honoring of the vestige of the temple. My own strong feeling is that John Paul II's greatness resides in the work he has done to achieve reconciliation between Jews and Christians. I'm a very severe critic of his as a sort of pathetically left-wing Catholic. Maybe I'm sure I'm more critical than you are, Tom, but of so much that he has done to hold back the reform that was begun by John the 23rd, especially, for example, in relationship to women. But on this issue, in relationship to Jews and Judaism, he has been our prophet. And I do believe it's because of his own personal experience. You began by talking about yours. And he says himself that it was when he returned to that small village of his where he had grown up in 1946 and found all of his Jewish neighbors and friends, as he put it, gone, simply gone, that I think he saw something that he clung to at the center of his papacy.
In that vein, when I first met him, I showed him a book that Rabbi Gelman and I had written, and I was talking about the God Squad. And he says, "Tom, you have to do this. This is very good. Tell the rabbi I send my blessing."
It's great.
When you get a blessing from the Pope, you take it. When I've celebrated Mass with him, and when he celebrates Mass, it's as though he's talking to God about all the pain he's ever experienced, he's ever seen. He really prays for the world, not just for Catholics, but for anyone that he's ever seen in pain. But in terms of the Holocaust survivors, he walked in the room, there were 70 Holocaust survivors, and he sat down and he said, "Welcome, my older brothers. Welcome to my home." And he said, "Some people wonder whether the Holocaust ever existed. We know. We lived through it." And he said, "Please tell me our story." And so they had a number of people get up and tell the stories. And he was just mesmerized because he had lived the same story himself. He himself was on the list to be exterminated. He had to go underground for 2 years. At night, we had the London Philharmonic there, and in protocol, no one ever sits on the same level as the Pope. The Pope is always at a higher level than everybody else. That particular night, he insisted that he be on the same level with the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, of Rome rather, and with the president of Italy. And there was a Marla piece that he heard about, and he eliminated it. Marla being somebody who converted to Christianity on his deathbed from Judaism. He didn't want to have anything that would be offensive to the Jewish community. Concluding this part before we get to questions, you have a sense of a Third Vatican Council or a way that maybe the Church can redeem certain of these painful moments. Could you share that with us?
Well, the Church is still ambivalent on so much of this. I mean, for all that we've said about John Paul II, he also stood by while Bashar Assad launched into a savage anti-Semitic assault in Syria last year. I'm sure you may have taken note of that too. This Pope embodying that ambivalence, we have some confusion about who to canonize, the canonization of Edith Stein and so forth. The Vatican's Dominus Jesus. Where's this ambivalence coming from? Well, it's because I don't think we've fully confronted some of the basic and what for us Christians have to be terrifying questions. Can we change what we say and think about our scriptures? What do we do with the anti-Jewish texts in the Gospels? The blood libel that Jews killed Jesus begins there, after all. It begins, really the problem begins with the gospel portrait of Jesus as in conflict with the Jewish people. as if he weren't himself a Jew, and so forth? Can we revise how we think about our scriptures? Can we change what we believe and preach about Jesus? The Christology, the theology of Christ, is very basically missing a crucial element, which is what? That he was and remained a Jew to the day he died, and that the God Jesus preached was nothing but the God of Israel. Can we Christians really confront what that means at the theological level? Can we confront the vestige of the abuse of power that begins with the church when the church becomes identical with the Roman Empire? The way power is exercised in the church. It's not for nothing that one of the first things John the 23rd said was, "I will never speak infallibly." He didn't take on the theological and organizational question of the infallibility of the Pope, but he said, "I will never speak infallibly." Why? Because there's something about absolutist and triumphalist claims that we still make as a church that is tied to this question. And then finally I say, only then, only once we've accomplished the basic work of going to the sources of this tradition of the hatred of Jews, will it be time for us to accomplish a real and full and complete act of repentance. And because, of course, the way in which I choose to imagine doing such fundamental work, which I do believe is, by the way, all underway, is by evoking the image of a Vatican Council that will have not just priests and bishops present as participants, but women, people on the margins of the church, people whose voices aren't ordinarily heard, and certainly including Jews and other people of other faiths. It's a fantasy, it's a dream. The truth is, it's happening. And why is it happening? It goes back to what you said about personal relationships, and I'll stop so that we can open up the discussion. But Christians and Jews know each other as neighbors, as friends. At the grassroots level, all over America, I've seen it. Christians, Catholics, and Jews meeting in rooms like this to take on this very difficult and painful question. And that's the leadership. That's where the leadership on this issue belongs. And one of the reasons I'm proud to be on the platform with you, Tom, is because you have been such an important part in stimulating the courage for Christians and Catholics in particular to take on this dark history. So maybe with that, we should.
Could we give Jim a round of applause for such a courageous work? What we promised to have you out of here by breakfast. Actually, we'd like to take some questions. There is a microphone right there, and if you could just line up. Please just do us one favor. If you could just ask a question, not write a book. Okay, and we'll be happy to answer as many as we can.
Would you care to share with us your views of the Vatican statements last week about the fact that we're both waiting for the same Messiah?
The question is a comment on the Vatican statement that was publicized last week that includes the affirmation that Christians and Jews are both waiting for the same Messiah. It's a very important point. I'm glad you brought it up. You know, last year, Dominus Jesus was published, a reiteration of the old Catholic claims that the Christian church is the central religious entity in the world, and that you can't really be fully Christian without being Catholic. I mean, it was a staggering, it didn't claim, as some people understood it to say, that you have to go to God through the church. It wasn't that medieval, but it was a reiteration in a very discouraging way of some old triumphalistic claims, especially in relationship to Judaism. And the overwhelmingly negative, powerful criticism that came of Dominus Jesus, especially, I would say, from two groups, Jews and Catholics, has its effect. And so there comes public, last week, a document that was published apparently last fall to no fanfare, that's a reflection on what it means to wait for the Messiah. And it's an affirmation. I haven't read the full text. I've only seen the news reports. But as I've read the news reports, it's an affirmation that we Christians and we Jews are both waiting for the Messiah. And we Christians are waiting for the Messiah to return the second time, and Jews are waiting for the Messiah to come the first time. The point is, it's the Vatican saying that Jewish waiting for the Messiah is authentic. The tradition is Jewish rejection of the first coming of the Messiah eliminates Jewish religion and Jewish hope. And Jews can only get with our program. That's the only thing Jews can do. I'm speaking in a sort of crass metaphorical way here. This is an important affirmation. Let me just, having said that, say that actually Martin Buber, of course, made it a generation and a half ago when he said that we Christians and we Jews have in common that we're both waiting for the Messiah. And he said, and when the Messiah comes, we Christians and Jews will simply ask him if he's been here before. And the distinguished Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick, a great man whose work I hope you know, who alas died last week, reported that anecdote of Buber's in his wonderful book, Philosophical Explanations. And then Robert Nozick said, and I would add to what Buber said, that when the Messiah comes and we ask him if he's been here before, the Messiah should reply, I don't remember.
Rabbi Gelman was telling me the other day, he says, if when we all die and we get up there, Jesus is checking in people, he says there are a lot of Jews going to be oh, for this I gave up lobster? But then he looked at me and he said, but Tom, if it's not Jesus, celibacy? I said to him, Mark, you win. Also, he was telling me a Jehovah's Witness came to try to convert him. Ha ha. So he listened to the spiel and he said to the guy, can I ask you a question? He said, sure. What religion was Jesus? He says, Jewish. What religion was Mary? Jewish. What religion was Joseph? Jewish. Well, if it was good enough for Jesus and his family, it's good enough for me. Next question.
I know that the book is on the church and the Jews, but it seems that since September 11th, somehow Muslims have to come into this whole picture. And I kept getting the feeling during the discussion that for the next 2,000 years, both the church and Jews are going to fight off Muslims in many ways. And I'd like you to comment on the whole problem with Islam.
Well, I especially welcome that remark because I think the last thing Jewish Christian, this is a comment and question about the place of Muslims in this discussion. And isn't it especially important now, given events in September, that this question be addressed in ways that includes Muslims. And I couldn't agree more. It's a very important point. And the last thing Jewish-Christian reconciliation needs to be is coalition building. And we Christians have a lot of work to do in relationship to Islam. As I said, by the way, a few minutes ago, the church renounced its crusader violence against Judaism. We didn't renounce our crusader violence against Islam. It's theologically appropriate. The crime of Christian Europe against Islam is a crime that has yet to be confronted in the Christian memory or the European memory. Europe came into existence as an entity against Islam. Charlemagne, remembered as the first great Christian Christendom emperor is the grandson of Charles Martel, who was a peasant nobody who was at the head of an army in 732 that beat the Islamic army in what we think of now as Tour France. And that was the defining moment that gave us Europe over against Islam. Islam is the ultimate hated other. Jews, of course, became the hated other within Christendom, but Islam is the hated other without. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ease with which Europe has identified Islam as the new menace has been terrifying. Islam, of course, has serious foundational work to do. Really looking at how its beliefs affect the world, and especially to look at the ways in which Islam has been hijacked, not just by the terrorists of September 11th, but I would also say by many of the preachers and religious figures who are leading the jihad against Israel and reviving in a terrifying way some of the worst Christian manifestations of anti-Semitism. But I would say the most important thing this discussion has to say to Islam is if the fundamental conflict between Christianity and Judaism, which is much more basic than any conflict between Judaism and Islam or between Christianity and Islam, if this can be addressed and changed, and I believe it is being, then there is no necessary conflict, ontologically speaking, with Islam either. Hannah Arendt warned against something called eternal anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews are fated to be the victim. We have to warn against something like the eternal clash of civilizations, as if Islam is fated to be the enemy. It's work that's just begun, but I suspect we'll all spend our lifetimes hopefully helping it, but certainly watching it unfold.
Mr. Carroll, you talk about the largest problem facing Christianity is to confront the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened. We lost 6 million Jews. My question to you is, Israel is in peril. The state of Israel is in peril. That is really what's threatening the Jewish community. And my question to you, circa 2002, where will the Christian West be when Israel, as it is threatened? And that's much more basic to me right now as a Jew, and I think should be to all of us.
Right.
That's the question of the day.
I hear you, and to elaborate the point I made before, one of the reasons I welcomed so profoundly John Paul II's clear identification, against the advice, by the way, of advisors in the Vatican, his clear affirmation of Israel, Jews at home in Israel, clear affirmation of the state, which, remember, the Vatican didn't recognize the state until 1994. Clear affirmation of the full and complete right of the state of Israel to secure borders, and so forth. I mean, I completely welcome that, and I think that was very important. Where is the Christian world in relationship to Israel? Firmly with Israel's absolute right to exist in security. Now, say again. Let me say.
You talked about. I just want to interject here. You talked about the great tragedy of Judaism. You went back in history,
yes,
and you said the great tragedy of Judaism was its dispersion and the loss of the patriarchy in 412, and that was the issue, and that we didn't have it until 1948.
Right.
And now it is threatened again.
I hear you, and what I'm telling you is, speaking as a Christian, 1948 is the work of God.
Yes.
The land of Israel is a sign of God's covenant.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I believe that, of course, it's quite clear that Christians are not unanimous on this, but Roman Catholicism, I believe, is firmly there. Firmly there. I would also say, even as I say this, my own strong strong conviction is that there is no security for Israel without justice for Palestinians. And I say that with my, I say that fully aware of the danger of glib comment about the crisis and the conflict in the Middle East. But it strikes me that no one is more eloquent on that particular subject than Israelis themselves. So, and Israelis need no lessons from the world about the impossibility of achieving security for Israel without some kind of settlement of the Palestinian question. So, tonight especially, our hearts are with Israel and Jerusalem and the people who yet again are in grief there. I mean, it's stunning, stunning.
My question is the Christian Bible in conflict with Jesus' teaching in many respects? And if there is one God, then why try to convert anybody to anything? I mean, we're worshiping the same God. He never prescribed any Bibles to the Jews or the Christians or the Muslims. These are ideas by certain people that they came up with, some very, very good. But still, I mean, we say Jesus, and he was a great man, undoubtedly, is the Christian Bible, I think, is in conflict with his teachings.
Yes. Let you remind me of Rabbi Heschel, who said that God is greater than religion. And Rabbi Heschel meant every religion. God is greater than the Christian religion. God is greater than the Christian texts. And the Christian texts reveal the humanity of the church. Nothing makes that clearer than the anti-Jewish diatribes in the Gospel of John, for example. And we work hard to understand how that's there and how it can be there. Your point is crucial. We Christians have to hear the anti-Jewish texts of the New Testament as if we are Jews. We have to learn to preach those texts against themselves. Much as I would say, we all have to learn to hear the anti-Canaanite texts in the Jewish scriptures as if we are Canaanites. And much I would also say, we have to learn to hear the anti-female texts of the whole Bible as if we are females. The whole Bible is shot through with manifestations that the people entrusted with the Word of God are human beings. And that isn't what disqualifies it, it's what qualifies it. It's what makes it magnificent, that God chooses human beings as God's creative instrument in the world.
Professor Carroll, I guess Mr. Carroll, I think one of the extraordinary things about your book is it takes such a long view of the history. I was wondering if you think, or what you think, is our position right now, which is really more a question of where the church is as an institution. I'm sure you've read Professor Kurtzer's book, The Popes Against the Jews, which lays out a shocking, to me, 19th century, essentially, history of the most vicious, official, church-based anti-Semitism in the Catholic press.
Right.
Right up to the Holocaust.
Right.
And perhaps beyond.
Right.
So here we are now in a little window of 20 or 30 years.
Right.
Post-Holocaust. And you make the statement that because the church may have recognized, the Vatican may have recognized Israel in 1994, we've turned a corner. And I just wonder whether in that whole post-Napoleonic history, you really have any confidence of that, given the context that we're living in.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make too much of the corner in 1994. All I would say is, imagine how we would be feeling in this room tonight if the Vatican had still not recognized the State of Israel. So the significance, in a way, was the...
I'm not sure. I mean, you may take some solace from that. I'm saying that on the historical record,
Yes.
particularly the historical record you have laid out,
Yes, yes.
the Jewish feeling on that may well be that could turn on a dime.
Well, you know, I hear what
And
you're saying.
I wonder if you share
and
that.
and the church is still, you know, one of the things about Constantine's sword is it returns again and again and again to the pivotal turning point moments in this history. And in more cases than not, the turning point was negative. In more cases than not, the turning point was negative. So, am I going to sit here tonight and say that at this turning point it won't surely will not be negative? No, I'm not a fool. And I think that that's one of the reasons why this work is so important and why it must be continued and why anti-Semitism, we have to do much more than say, I'm sorry.
Well, could you, how would you characterize, you referred before to forces within the church
Right.
that opposed that decision, that counseled the Pope not to do
Right.
that in 1994.
Right.
Who are those forces?
Well,
how would you characterize
Here's how
them?
I think of it. In the Vatican itself, for example, the Vatican, we often think about it as if it's a univocal, sort of one-note kind of place with one voice. It's not. It's like the United States Senate. There's a Ted Kennedy and there's a Jesse Helms. And there's a ferocious argument going on now. And I believe that in this period, when the Pope is frail, and Tom, you pay closer attention to this than I do, and I know your sources are better than mine, but I believe in this period when the Pope is frail that the power has shifted to the bureaucracy more than in many years. And the argument now between the Ted Kennedy, I don't know what his name is, you might, and the Jesse Helms is powerful. And what's at stake in this? Well, I would say it's the same thing that's at stake in the argument the United States of America is having with itself right now. Are we going to be triumphalistic, aggrandizing people who exercise power irresponsibly or not? Same question for us Catholics. So you're right. That's what I'm doing here tonight. I believe that's what Tom Hartman is doing all the time, participating in this discussion. We Catholics with each other having a fierce argument right now. But the argument itself is the sign of hope for me.
Just want to say that I enjoyed the history discussed this evening, and your presentations I think were fabulous. You're among Jews primarily, I'm sure maybe almost 100%. Has this kind of discussion ever taken place between the two of you or anybody like yourselves among strictly a Christian audience? And I wonder how they'd react to this discussion of learning.
Well, I'm able to tell you that since Constantine's Sword was published a little more than a year ago, I have been privileged to be in discussions like this at many different kinds of places, many Jewish-Christian encounters, some mostly Jewish audiences, and many mostly Catholic audiences and Christian audiences, especially at Catholic universities. Jesuit universities, mostly, all over the country. I will tell you that I'm not I think Tom's presence here tonight is a signal of this. I'm not a marginal Catholic who's sort of standing on the outside by myself raising these questions. I'm speaking out of a community of people who are grappling with these questions, and most of them have been my teachers. Would you make a comment on that? I mean, how?
I think you can't underestimate the change that has happened in the Catholic Church as a result of Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II. I know, for example, in the concert that we put together, it took the Pope a year to actually finalize it because he wanted to make sure that all of the bishops in Rome were there. He wanted to show a sign of unity and solidarity. We have had a history of taking out different texts, some of the texts you referred to in John's Gospel, where theologians are looking at it and saying this is no longer appropriate. We're looking at the textbooks. The Vatican Council clearly said it was not the Jews that killed Jesus. So all of these things, layering one on top of the other, bring us to a point where thinking Catholics are saying, we want to know more about the history, and we want to know where we were wrong. Also, I think the example of Pope John Paul II asking apologies is an extraordinary venture. I know Rabbi Gelman and I were on IMUS, and we were talking about that apology. And it was Rabbi Gelman who said, the apology wasn't perfect, but you got to cut this guy some slack. You know, he is really making history in the things that he's doing. And he says, we Jews have to get behind somebody who's trying to extend an olive branch to us, and not fall into the pattern of saying, yeah, you said a lot, but you didn't say enough. Or you said a lot, but you didn't say the 2 sentences I thought you ought to say. My presence, Mark and I have been best friends for 16 years. And when we first started, people were skeptical. They thought he'd water down Judaism and I would water down Catholicism. What we knew was he was a working rabbi and I was a working priest. And now it's gotten to the point where wherever either one of us goes, people expect that the other one is going to be there. I mean, I had a woman, I said Mass the other day, and this 80-year-old Boston Irish Catholic-like lady comes out and says, Father, I watch the God Squad every night, and I have to tell you, I like the rabbi more than you. And I went, yes, that's what we had hoped for. And that's really why we have this evening. We really want to leave here with hope. We really want to leave here with there's more work to be done. But people like yourselves, people like ourselves, are trying to do it. Thank you.
I'd like to ask each of you a fundamental theological question with respect to Christianity. And if you could, I'd appreciate it if you could each answer as individuals, as yourselves, and whatever way you can on behalf of the church that in some part you're representing here tonight, at least, you know, the Father Tom is. And let me tell you why I'm asking this question. I've been told by a previous supervisor, and even my current supervisor, in heart-to-heart discussions, that because I'm a Jew, they believe that because I don't take Jesus Christ to be my personal Savior, and as the Son of God, and as the Messiah will come to redeem the world, that I will burn in hell for eternity for not having accepted that. And they really believe this, and most devout Christians really believe this. And when I heard this both times, I mean, I was very personally offended by this, because that says that no matter what I do in my life, theologically, with respect to any Jewish teachings, with respect to charity or prayer or repentance or anything, if one were to believe that tenet, and if Christianity is right in that, then all Jews are going to go to hell and burn forever. So my question to you is, as individuals, do you each believe that? Because that goes to the heart, in large part, of what we're talking about here tonight. And do you think the church believes that? And do each of you think the church will change its position on that? That's my question.
Well, the good news is that the church doesn't believe that. The good news is that you probably get a good seat in heaven. You look like a person who's going to go right to heaven to me.
Well,
and there is a passage in John's Gospel that evangelical and fundamentalists will quote. It says, unless you be born again in water and the Spirit, you shall not enter the kingdom of God. The Johannine Gospel was written not to the general population, but was written to the Christians. And that particular passage was written not to people who are unbaptized, but to people who were baptized. And it was basically a way of saying, someplace in your life, your faith has to go from here to here. It's got to be personalized. But the passage that you will take great comfort in is Matthew 25. Jesus says, at the end time, when the Son of Man comes, he's going to gather everyone before him. He's going to say, some to the right, some to the left. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was in prison, and you visited me. I was sick, and you took care of me. And they will say, when, Lord, did we do it to you? He said, as long as you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me. The teaching of Christianity is that every person, that Jesus died for everybody, and everyone who is trying to live a good, legitimate life will go to heaven.
Well, I have to tell you, and I appreciate what you're telling me here, but every reasonably observant Christian I've ever spoken to has told me that they believe that whoever does not take on Jesus Christ as their Savior will not go to heaven and will burn forever.
Well,
do you each believe? I mean, what are both of your positions on this as individuals?
Let me just say it's a very important question, and I'm glad you've put it on the table. And the reason is because you're absolutely right. Many Christians believe it. I was taught that as a child. I was ushered into the idea, the shorthand, the slogan we used to say was no salvation outside the church. I don't know if it's any consolation to you, but I used to think that Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists were also doomed. The Roman Catholic Church and mainstream Christianity has, I would say, entirely repudiated this chauvinism, this religious chauvinism. The reason it's still an important question, of course, is because many Christians, perhaps the majority, who read the texts much more literally and, as we say, fundamentalistically, are stuck in this triumphalist frame of mind, which is, again, the point of the discussion, the argument, the challenge. You're right to raise it. And only a minute ago, it was true of all of us, but it's not anymore.
Do you believe that?
No.
We believe you're going to be okay.
But no.
As a matter of fact, we can sense that you have Mother Teresa type
Father
qualities.
Tom, as a priest, do you believe that? Yes or no?
Yeah.
I believe that you will go to heaven.
You didn't answer my question.
Yes, he did.
Okay.
I would like to first say I would like to say that I'm a great admirer of the God Squad, and I often hear you on IMUS. And I have been a great admirer of your book, and I have heard you before, and you're very brave. You go into Protestant churches, etc. My question...
I always bless myself.
My question has to do with Israel. Why, many times I've heard the statement, justice for the Palestinians.
Yes.
Why, sir, is it only justice for the Palestinians? Justice for the Jewish people is not a phrase that I often hear. We, the Jewish people, have been without a state for all of these years, for all of these thousands of years, let alone wandered, but never felt at home. Finally, we have the state of Israel. Why is it so important, the phrase justice for the Palestinians? The Palestinians, the people who should be taking care of the Palestinians, they don't do it. There is no Arab country where Palestinians have really been welcome.
Well, let me say, since I'm the person who used that phrase, let me respond to you by saying I agree with the thrust of what you're saying. It's certainly true that not only have Arab countries neglected Palestinians, they have exploited the terrible situation of this desperate people in a very cynical and criminal way, I would say, and it's still going on. And so I agree with you. But listen, I'm not someone who accepts the idea that you have to choose between what Israel needs in its fullness in every way and what the people who live in the Palestinian areas need. I believe that it's desperately important that we continue to affirm possibility for both peoples, because and no one is more powerful about that than Israelis. That's the thing that I don't presume to say this of my own authority. But there is absolutely no future for either people without some kind of coming together in some kind of way of living together.
I just got back from Israel a few weeks ago, and we were surrounded by all the bombing. I went into the West Bank, so I've just had that experience.
Yes.
And I heard Avram Berg, who is the new head of the Labor Party, and he said something that was very interesting. He said, we are willing to have the Palestinians have one state, but what they really want are two states. They want their own state, and they want the state of Israel.
Yes.
And anybody who has studied their history and heard Yasser Arafat in the translations, that happens to be true.
Yes. Well, you know, this is not an issue that we're going to be able to move on tonight. But let me just say, I think it's also desperately important that we not reduce the Palestinian position to they, because there has been. Today it's polarized, but there has been, as recently as last summer, serious evidence of powerful positions among the mainstream Palestinian population of true desire for reconciliation with Israel, respecting Israel's security demands. So, and I believe that that's there yet. If you don't believe that, then we're condemned to hopelessness.
And I have the unfortunate task of saying that the evening, good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.